me tell you what it feels like to walk into a room and see your own dream wearing someone else's name. It's not loud. That's the thing nobody tells you. You don't gasp. You don't make a scene. You don't do any of the things you might imagine you'd do. You just stop. Right there in the middle of a crowded conference hall, with people moving around you in every direction, with conversation and music and the clink of glasses, you just stop. And for a moment, everything goes completely silent inside your head. The booth was large, professional. A nice logo, clean, modern, the kind of design that costs real money. A tagline on the banner that I had once written in slightly different words on a napkin in a coffee shop at 11 o'clock at night, half excited and half terrified that the idea might actually be good enough to pursue. A product description on the display panel that matched, beat for beat, the structure of a document I had spent 4 months building. And behind the booth, shaking hands with someone in a gray blazer, laughing at something he said, was the person I had trusted with all of it. My name is Kate. I'm 32 years old, and I want to tell you about the 2 years between that coffee shop napkin and that conference hall. About what it costs to have your trust used against you by someone you loved. About what it takes to get back up when the person who knocked you down used your own blueprint to do it. And about what I found on the other side of all of it, which was not what I expected, and which turned out to be worth every single painful step to get there. Before I go any further, if you've ever had someone take something from you that wasn't theirs to take, if you've ever had to decide whether to let that be the end of your story or the beginning of a different one, please hit like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now. I read every single one. Now let me take you back 2 years. To a coffee shop on a Thursday evening. To 2 women sitting across from each other at a small table by the window. And to the moment I made the mistake of believing that some people are safe. Sarah and I had been friends for 10 years by the time any of this happened. 10 years is a long time. Long enough that you stop keeping track of whose turn it is to pay for dinner. Long enough that you've seen each other through bad relationships, family problems, career pivots, the kind of 2 a.m. phone calls that have nothing to do with emergencies and everything to do with needing to hear a familiar voice. We met in our second year of college. She sat down next to me in a business strategy class, borrowed a pen, and never really gave it back. That was how she was. She moved through the world like she already belonged everywhere she went. Sarah was magnetic in a way that I never was and never tried to be. She could walk into a room of strangers and within 20 minutes have 3 people laughing and one of them exchanging contact information. She remembered names, details, the small things people mentioned once and thought no one was paying attention to. She had a gift for making you feel like the most interesting person in the room, which, I understand now, is one of the most powerful things a person can do. And one of the most dangerous. I was different. I was the one who sat with ideas for a long time before saying them out loud, who filled notebooks before making moves, who thought in systems and structures and what-ifs. We used to joke that between the 2 of us, we had one complete entrepreneur. She could sell it, I could build it. It seemed like a perfect match. It seemed like the foundation of something great. The idea came to me slowly, the way the best ones do. Not in a flash, but in an accumulation of smaller observations over time. I had spent 2 years doing freelance consulting for small businesses, and the same problem kept showing up in different forms. These businesses had great products, real customers, genuine potential, but they were drowning in disconnected tools. 5 different platforms for 5 different functions, none of them talking to each other. The business owner spending half their week on logistics that should have been automatic. I started sketching a solution, an integrated platform built specifically for small operations that would pull everything together in one place. Simple enough that you didn't need a tech team. Smart enough that it actually solved something. I worked on it for 4 months before I told anyone. I had 60 pages of notes, a rough financial model, a user experience sketch, and a list of potential early clients I had already quietly tested the concept with. I was ready. Or close enough to ready that I needed a second brain to pressure test it. I called Sarah. We met at our usual coffee shop on a Thursday evening in October. I had my notebook with me. I remember ordering a coffee I barely touched because I was too nervous to drink it. I laid everything out on the table, literally, physically, page by page, and I talked her through it. The problem, the solution, the market, the early validation, the path forward. She leaned in the whole time, asked questions that showed she was actually thinking, not just listening politely. Asked me about the revenue model, about the competitive landscape, about how I plan to handle customer support at scale. Good questions, smart questions. The kind that made me feel like I was talking to a partner, not just a friend. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Kate, this is genuinely good. Like, this is actually something. You need to move on this." I went home that night feeling more certain about the idea than I had ever felt. Like it had become real in the telling of it. Like sharing it had made it more solid, not less. I had no idea what I had just done. 3 months passed. Good months, productive months. I refined the plan, started identifying potential investors, put together a proper pitch deck. The concept was getting sharper the more I worked on it. I was close enough to ready that I wanted to loop Sarah back in, partly to update her, partly because I was considering asking her to come on as a co-founder. She had the relationship skills I lacked. It seemed like the natural move. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon. No answer. I texted. Got a reply an hour later. "Hey, sorry, absolutely swamped right now. Let's catch up soon." That happened twice more over the following 2 weeks. Always a version of the same message. Always soon, always later. Always a door left slightly ajar and never opened. I told myself she was busy. People get busy. I didn't push. Then, on a Wednesday morning in January, a message came in from a woman named Claire, someone we both knew from a networking group we'd attended the previous year. The message said, "Have you seen this?" And there was a link. I clicked it. It was a website. Clean design, professional copy, a product description laid out across the homepage. An online platform for small businesses, integrated tools, simplified operations, designed specifically for small teams without dedicated tech support. I read it 3 times. The words weren't identical to mine, but the structure was mine. The framing was mine. The specific combination of problems being solved and the way they were sequenced. That was from my 60 pages of notes, from the 4 months I had spent building the architecture of an idea before I said it out loud to anyone. Anyone except Sarah. The founder listed on the About page was Sarah. I sat at my desk for a long time without moving. Then I picked up my phone and called her. This time she answered on the second ring. She sounded normal. That was the part that hit hardest. Not guilty, not nervous, just normal. Like it was any other Tuesday. I told her I had seen the website. I told her it looked familiar. I kept my voice even. I was proud of myself for that. The pause that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then she said, "Kate, I've been thinking about this space for a long time. We obviously think similarly about some things. That's why we're friends. But this is my concept. I'm sorry if the overlap is confusing." That was it. That was the whole response. Not an explanation, not a justification, just a flat, confident reframe, delivered in the tone of someone who had prepared for this conversation and decided which version of events they were going with. I said, "Sarah, I showed you my plan. I showed you 60 pages. I showed you the financial model and the user research and the pitch deck structure." She said, "I know you did, and I think your version of this is interesting, but mine is different. I have to go. I have a call in 5 minutes." She hung up. I sat with my phone in my hand and tried to understand what had just happened. Not the facts. The facts were clear enough. I was trying to understand how someone does that. How a person sits across a table from someone they've known for 10 years, listens to their dream laid out in 60 pages of detail, and then decides, "I'll take that." How they then answer the phone 2 months later and say it with a steady voice. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. I called a lawyer the next week. I laid out everything I had, the notebook with dates, the emails I had sent myself as I developed the concept, screenshots of my pitch deck files with their creation timestamps, the text messages I had sent Sarah over the 3 months between our coffee shop meeting and her launch. The lawyer listened carefully. Then he said, "I understand your situation, and I believe you. But I want to be honest with you about what we're working with. A business concept is not automatically protected by copyright. What you've described, the idea, the framework, the market approach, these are difficult things to claim ownership over without a signed non-disclosure agreement or a formal partnership contract. Your timestamps help establish that your work predates hers. But establishing legal theft of a business idea is an extremely high bar. You're looking at a long, expensive process with an uncertain outcome." I asked him what he would do in my position. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "Honestly, I'd go build it anyway. And I'd build it better." I didn't take his advice right away. I went home and I fell apart instead, which I think was necessary and which I don't apologize for. I spent 2 weeks in a state I can only describe as a kind of fog, functioning on the surface, getting dressed, answering emails, making coffee, but operating at about 30% capacity with the rest of my brain stuck in a loop that kept returning to the same questions. How did I not see this coming? What did I miss? Was any of it real? The 10 years, the friendship, the borrowed pen in that business strategy class. Was any of it what I thought it was? The worst part wasn't the anger. The anger was manageable. The worst part was the self-doubt that moved in right behind it and made itself comfortable. Because when someone you trust completely does something like this, there's a voice that says, "You let this happen. You were naive. You handed someone a weapon and then acted surprised when they used it." And that voice is persuasive, because it's not entirely wrong, and because it sounds like logic, even when it's really just cruelty directed inward. I lost a month to that voice, maybe more. My sister noticed first. She came to visit one Saturday and found me sitting at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a blank laptop screen and a general air of someone who had misplaced something essential and wasn't sure they'd ever find it again. She sat down across from me. She said, "Tell me what you need." I said, "I didn't know." She said, "Okay, then I'm just going to sit here." She sat there for 3 hours. We barely talked, but something about not being alone in it, something about having someone physically present who wasn't going anywhere, started to shift something. By the time she left, I wasn't better, but I was slightly less stuck. I opened the laptop that night for the first time in 2 weeks. Not to work, just to see if I still could. It was a Thursday evening in March, 2 months after everything happened, and I was doing one of those things you do when you're not quite ready to get back to your real life. Attending events that feel productive without requiring you to actually produce anything. A panel discussion at a co-working space downtown, 4 entrepreneurs talking about failure. I went because a newsletter I subscribed to mentioned it, and I had nothing else going on, and staying in the apartment one more evening felt worse than going somewhere. The first 3 panelists were fine. Good stories, honest reflection, the usual arc of setback and recovery. I was half listening, mostly watching the room, thinking about whether to leave before the Q&A. Then the 4th person started talking. He was maybe 50, understated, the kind of person you wouldn't notice in a crowd. He had started 2 companies that failed significantly before building one that succeeded. He talked about the first failure with the particular clarity of someone who has had a long time to understand what actually happened. But it was one specific thing he said, almost an aside, not the centerpiece of his talk, that I have never forgotten. He said, "The most dangerous thing about being betrayed by someone in business is not what they took from you. It's what you might give them afterward, which is your next 2 years spent being angry in their direction instead of building in your own."
The best answer to someone who stole your idea is an execution they can't touch. Not a lawsuit, not a confrontation, an execution. Because a concept on paper belongs to whoever files it first, but a company that actually works, built by the person who understood it from the inside, that belongs to you in a way nothing can touch. I wrote it down on the back of a receipt I found in my jacket pocket. The exact words, as close as I could get them. I drove home and sat in my car outside my building for about 10 minutes. Then I went upstairs, made coffee, opened my laptop, and opened a new document. I did not open the old plan. I didn't want to rebuild what she had taken. I wanted to build what she couldn't reach. Something that came from everything I had learned in the months since, including the months of watching her version of my idea interact with the actual market and seeing where it was weak. I had information she didn't have. I had clarity she couldn't manufacture. And I had something she had fundamentally underestimated, which was that I understood the idea all the way down to its bones, because I had built it from scratch, in my own mind, before I ever said it out loud. I started writing at 11:30 at night. I stopped at 3 in the morning. When I went to bed, I had the outline of something. Not a plan yet, the skeleton of one. But it was mine. In a way, nothing had felt mine in 2 months. I set an alarm for 7. For the first time in weeks, I actually wanted to get up when it went off. The first thing I did was change the question I was asking myself. For 2 months, I had been asking, how could she do that? Which is a reasonable question, but a useless one, because the answer doesn't exist in any form that helps you move forward. You can spend years on that question and arrive nowhere. So I stopped asking it. I replaced it with a different one. What do I actually know now that I didn't know 6 months ago? And the answer to that question was longer than I expected. I knew the market better. I had watched Sarah's version of the product launch in real time, the messaging she led with, the audience she targeted first, the features she chose to highlight. I had watched what got traction and what didn't.
I had watched the early reviews from users who were excited and then quietly disappointed. I had information she had spent real money to generate, and I had it for free, from the outside, with the particular clarity of someone who wasn't emotionally invested in the results looking good. I knew what I would do differently, not just because her version was missing things, though it was, but because 6 months of additional thinking had sharpened my own understanding of the problem in ways that my original plan hadn't captured yet. The 60 pages I had shown Sarah were a beginning. What I was building now was what came after a beginning. And I knew, more concretely than I had before, exactly who my first customer was going to be. Her name was Donna. She ran a small catering business out of a commercial kitchen she rented 3 days a week, had 6 part-time employees, and had been managing her scheduling, invoicing, supplier communication, and customer follow-up across 4 completely separate platforms that had never once spoken to each other. I had consulted for her briefly the previous year. I called her in March, explained what I was building, and asked if she'd be willing to be a beta user. Free of charge, full access, in exchange for honest feedback. She said yes before I finished the sentence. I built the first working version in 8 weeks. Not alone. I found a developer named Marcus through a referral from a former colleague, a quiet, methodical man who had strong opinions about clean code and almost no opinions about anything else, which made him an ideal first collaborator. We worked out of my apartment for the first 3 months. I took the kitchen table, he took the couch. We ordered a lot of takeout. We argued about the interface approximately 400 times. Donna went live with the beta in June. Her feedback was specific, sometimes harsh, and completely invaluable. She used the product the way real people use products, impatiently, imperfectly, with different goals on different days, and zero tolerance for things that didn't work intuitively. Every piece of friction she found was a gift. We fixed things in real time, sometimes overnight, and then called her back to test the fix. By August, 2 of Donna's business contacts had asked her what she was using to manage operations so smoothly. She sent them to me. They became customers 2 and 3. I did not celebrate any of this publicly. I had no social media presence for the company yet, no press, no announcement of any kind. I was building in quiet on purpose, partly because I wasn't ready, and partly because I had developed a firm belief, based on recent experience, that the fewer people who knew what I was doing before I was ready, the better. The first time someone paid me for the product, I sat at my kitchen table for a few minutes and did not do anything in particular. I just sat there. Then I texted my sister one word: "It's working." She sent back a voice message that I still have saved somewhere. Just her screaming incoherently for about 12 seconds. That felt right. By the fall of that first year, I had 11 paying customers, 1 full-time employee besides Marcus, a small but growing retention rate that I tracked obsessively, and a very clear sense of exactly where we were strong and exactly where we still had work to do. I knew the product's weaknesses better than anyone because I had been the one sitting on calls with customers when those weaknesses showed up and watching their faces. I also started hearing about Sarah. Not from her directly. We hadn't spoken since that phone call in January, and I had made peace with the likelihood that we never would again. I heard about her the way you hear about anyone in a small industry, through the ambient noise of the market. Mutual contacts who mentioned her without realizing they were mentioning her. Industry newsletters. A profile piece in a business publication that I read once, carefully, and then set aside. Her company had raised a seed round in the spring. A decent amount, enough to hire a real team, run paid advertising, exhibit at conferences, and generate the kind of visible momentum that reads as success from a distance. The product had launched publicly with a press push that got some coverage. On paper, things looked strong. But I was starting to hear other things underneath the surface noise. A customer of mine, a woman who ran a small marketing consultancy, mentioned in passing that she had tried Sarah's platform before finding mine. I asked, carefully, what her experience had been. She thought about it for a moment and said, "It looked like exactly what I needed. But when I actually started using it, it felt like it had been built by someone who had a clear picture of what the product should look like, but maybe a less clear picture of what it should actually do." Does that make sense? It made complete sense to me. What I was observing from a careful distance was the difference between a product built by someone who understood the problem from the inside and a product built by someone who understood the pitch. Sarah was extraordinary at the pitch. She always had been. She could walk into a room and make investors feel like they were about to miss the most important opportunity of the year. What she was less extraordinary at was the long, unglamorous, detail-saturated work of figuring out exactly why someone's operations were broken and building something that fixed the actual problem rather than the surface presentation of the problem. Customers were noticing. Not loudly. There was no public backlash, no damaging reviews, nothing dramatic. Just the quiet, ordinary attrition of people who sign up for something that looked right and gradually realize it isn't quite doing what they needed it to do. Churn. The metric that doesn't show up in the press releases. My retention was high. Not perfect, nothing is perfect, but high in a way that was starting to matter. The customers who joined us in the first months were still there at month 6, at month 9, at month 12. Some of them had expanded their usage. Some of them had referred someone else. The compound effect of keeping customers is slow at first, and then suddenly, it isn't. It becomes the most powerful force in the business, quietly building something that's very hard for a competitor to replicate with a marketing budget. I didn't feel triumphant about any of this. I felt focused. There's a difference. Triumph looks backward. Focus looks forward, at the next thing that needs doing. And there was always a next thing that needed doing. The invitation came in February, about 20 months after I had opened that new document at 11:30 at night in my apartment. A regional business conference, the kind that draws a few hundred people from across the industry, a mix of founders, investors, and operators. They were putting together a panel on building sustainable small business infrastructure, and someone who had heard me speak at a smaller event the previous fall had passed my name along. Would I be interested in joining as a panelist? I said yes. Then I looked at the conference website and saw the full list of exhibitors. Sarah's company had a booth. I sat with that information for about a day, considered, genuinely, whether to pull out. Not out of fear, I want to be clear about that, but out of a practical question about whether the distraction was worth it, whether being in the same room as her for the first time in nearly 2 years would cost me more than the speaking opportunity was worth. I decided to go. Because pulling out would have been a decision made in her direction, and I had spent 20 months making decisions in my own direction, and I wasn't about to stop now. The morning of the conference, I got there early. Set up, walked the floor before it filled up, got a coffee from the catering table, and stood near the back of the main hall watching people arrive. Her booth was in the center section, large, well-designed, staffed by 3 people in matching branded shirts. It looked impressive. From a distance, it looked like exactly what success is supposed to look like. I was at the registration desk when she walked past. She didn't see me immediately. She was talking to someone on her team, gesturing at something on a tablet,
fully absorbed. Then she looked up and stopped. The moment lasted maybe 3 seconds, which is a very long time when you're inside it. She looked different than I remembered. Or maybe the same, but in a different way. There was something around her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not guilt exactly. Something more like the particular tiredness of someone who has been performing confidence for a long time and is starting to feel the effort of it. I didn't look away. I didn't smile, and I didn't glare. I just held the eye contact for those 3 seconds with an expression I hope communicated nothing more complicated than, "I see you. I'm here. I'm fine." Then I turned back to the registration desk and got my badge. We didn't speak that day. Not directly. We were on opposite sides of the same room for 8 hours, and we managed it the way adults manage things they don't have words for, by staying in their own lane and not manufacturing a confrontation that didn't need to happen. I went on stage at 2 in the afternoon for the panel. 3 of us, 45 minutes, a moderator who asked good questions. I talked about retention, about building for depth rather than breadth, about what it actually means to solve a problem versus what it means to pitch a solution to a problem. I didn't look at her booth while I was talking. I didn't need to. Afterward, a woman came up to me at the edge of the stage. She introduced herself as the operations director for a small chain of retail stores. 9 locations, chronic disorganization across the locations, had been looking for a platform solution for 8 months. She said, "I listened to both panels today, yours and the one from the other platform earlier. They're saying similar things on the surface, but what you're describing sounds like it comes from actually being inside this problem. Can we set up a call?" Her name was Patricia. She became our largest client 3 months later. The 6 months after the conference were the fastest and strangest of the 2 years. Patricia's company came on board in May, and her scale was larger than anything we had handled before. 9 locations, complex interdependencies, the kind of implementation that requires real hand-holding and real patience and real willingness to adapt the product in real time based on what you find when you get into the actual operations. We worked hard. There were weeks where I barely slept. There were moments where I genuinely wasn't sure we could deliver at the level she needed. We delivered. And when we delivered, Patricia talked about it. Not loudly. She was not a person who broadcast things, but specifically to specific people in her network who she thought might benefit from what she'd found. That kind of referral is different from marketing. It carries a weight that no advertisement can manufacture. It says, "I know this person. I watched them work. I can vouch for what they did. Come with my name attached." 3 new clients came through Patricia's network in the fall, 2 more in the winter. And then, in November, something unexpected happened. An investor reached out. A small but well-regarded firm that focused specifically on B2B software tools for small businesses, exactly the space we were in. They'd been watching the market for about a year, they said, and they had noticed something. They had noticed that one company in the space was growing quickly and loudly, and another was growing quietly and stickily. And in their experience, those 2 patterns tend to predict very different long-term outcomes. They wanted to have a conversation. I want to be honest about what that felt like, because I think people imagine these moments as pure triumph, and they're not. They're more complicated than that. I sat across from those investors and talked about the company for 2 hours, and I was proud of what I had built, genuinely proud, in the deep and specific way you're proud of something that cost you a lot.
But I also kept thinking, in the background, quietly, about the coffee shop in October 2 years ago. About 60 pages of notes spread across a small table. About a person who sat across from me and asked all the right questions. I didn't say any of that out loud. It wasn't relevant to the meeting. What I did hear, through mutual connections in the weeks that followed, was that Sarah's company had begun to have a harder quarter. The growth numbers that had looked so impressive in the press releases were running into the reality of high churn. Customers acquired quickly and lost almost as quickly. The seed money that had funded the aggressive launch was thinner than it had been. There had been some team changes. Things were, by all accounts, more difficult than they appeared from the outside. I didn't feel satisfaction about that. I want to be honest about that too, because I think it would be a cleaner story if I had. But I didn't. What I felt was something more like recognition. The quiet, unsentimental acknowledgement that the market had simply done what markets do, which is eventually reward what actually works and expose what doesn't. You can build fast on someone else's blueprint, but you can't sustain on it. Because a blueprint without understanding is just paper, and paper doesn't hold up when the real work starts. It's a Thursday afternoon as I write this, or as I tell you this, whichever way you want to think about it. I'm sitting at a desk in an office that has 8 people in it. My office. We sign the lease ourselves, we pay for it ourselves, it belongs to us. There's a whiteboard on the wall covered in marker notes from a product meeting we had this morning. There's a dog under the desk belonging to one of our developers, who asked if she could bring him in on Thursdays, and to whom I said yes immediately, because I work with people I want to work with, and small things like this matter. There's a plant in the corner that I bought 3 months ago and have somehow kept alive, which I consider one of my more impressive recent achievements. I look at this room sometimes, and I think about the kitchen table, the couch where Marcus worked, the $45 takeout budget we split every week in the early months because neither of us was taking a salary yet, and we needed to be strategic about everything, including dinner. I think about Donna, who is still a customer, who sent me a handwritten card last spring that I have pinned above my desk that says simply, "Thank you for building something that actually helps." I think about Patricia, who introduced herself at the edge of a stage after listening to 2 panels and making a careful, considered judgment about which one was telling her something real. And occasionally, less often now than before, but occasionally, I think about Sarah. I don't know exactly where she is or what her company looks like today. I stopped tracking it deliberately around month 18 because I realized that paying attention to it was a form of staying connected to something I needed to let go of. What I do know is that at some point in the past 2 years, she and I ended up in the same industry, solving versions of the same problem, and the market got to observe both of us up close. And then the market decided what it decided. I'm not going to tell you I've forgiven her in some clean, resolved, movie ending kind of way. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, the kind that doesn't require the other person to do anything first, takes longer than 2 years, and I'm still working on it. What I can tell you is that I stopped being angry at her in the way that costs you something. The anger that makes you lose sleep, that redirects your energy in her direction when it should be going into your own work. That kind of anger? I let that go somewhere in the middle of month 4, around the time Donna gave me the feedback that led to the redesign, that led to the retention numbers, that eventually led to Patricia and the investors and this office and the dog under the desk. I let it go because I needed the space it was taking up. Because there was something I wanted to build, and I couldn't build it while I was using half my attention to be angry. Here is what I know about stolen ideas. An idea is not the most valuable thing you have. The most valuable thing you have is your understanding of the idea, the full, lived, inside-out comprehension of why the problem exists and what would actually fix it, built up over months of thinking and testing and listening to real people tell you what their real lives are like. That understanding cannot be stolen. It cannot be copied from 60 pages of notes, or a pitch deck, or a product description on a website. It lives in you. And as long as it lives in you, the idea is not gone. It has just been temporarily borrowed by someone who will eventually show you, through their execution, exactly what they didn't understand about it. The thing you should be most afraid of is not someone stealing your idea. It is letting their theft stop you from building it. Because here is the truth. If you had the idea once, from the inside, out of genuine understanding and genuine problem solving, you can build it again. Better. With everything you've learned in the time since, with the particular, unduplicable advantage of being the person who understood it first. They got a head start. I got something more durable. If you're sitting with something right now, an idea you've been afraid to pursue, a dream that someone made you feel wasn't yours to claim, a plan that got knocked down before it ever got off the ground, I want you to hear this directly. The clock is not the enemy. The person who took something from you is not the enemy. The only thing that can actually stop you is your own decision to let the theft be the last word. Don't let it be the last word. If this story meant something to you, if you've had to rebuild something from the ground up, or if you're standing at the beginning of a rebuild right now, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if someone out there is sitting on a 60-page plan that they've been afraid to share with anyone, or afraid to pursue, or afraid to believe in, I see you. And I hope this helps. Thank you for being here. Like if this story touched you. Subscribe if you want to hear more.